A wealthy black man disguises himself as an everyday shopper to visit his own luxury store, where the ignorant owner hurls racist remarks at him. The owner's arrogant smile vanishes the next day when he walks into company headquarters and finds his suspicious customer sitting in the CEO's chair. Before we proceed, who's the most interesting person you've ever met? I'd love to hear the story. Jason walked into the small clothing store tucked between two massive buildings, catering more to everyday New Yorkers than the city's elite. He bought a simple pair of jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and scuffed sneakers. In the mirror, he almost didn't recognize himself. "Need a bag for those?" the cashier asked, raising an eyebrow as Jason carefully folded his gold Rolex and bespoke shoes into a plain duffel bag. "No thanks," Jason replied, slipping his expensive suit inside. He wasn't Jason Russell, CEO, anymore. He was just Jason. Outside, he paused, taking a breath. People brushed past him without a second glance. He felt exposed and strangely free. Still, he understood that this was the reality many people faced every day, particularly those who didn't fit society's narrow mold of wealth and status. For a moment, he hesitated. Part of him wondered if this was necessary, if he was making too big a deal of these rumors. But he knew that if he ignored this, he would be failing the very people he claimed to champion through his brand. The luxury store the complaint was majorly coming from was just a few blocks away, in one of Manhattan's upscale districts. It was a magnificent, imposing structure with tall glass windows that displayed curated outfits under soft lighting. He knew the store well. He had personally overseen its design and launch. Inside the store, everything gleamed: marble floors, meticulously arranged shelves, and showcases filled with luxury items ranging from designer handbags to exclusive jewelry pieces. For many, stepping into one of his stores was like entering a world of elegance and exclusivity. As he approached the doors, Jason took a deep breath to properly gather himself. He would be just another face in the crowd, just another customer walking in off the street. His heart beat faster as he gripped the handle and stepped inside, immediately engulfed by the familiar scent of sandalwood and fresh leather. It was strange, feeling like a stranger in a place that was his own, but that was exactly why he was here. The store was alive with activity. Elegantly dressed men and women browsing the shelves, soft classical music playing in the background. Jason lingered near the entrance for a minute, observing the employees as they moved around, offering help to some customers while casting polite but distanced glances at others. No one seemed to notice Jason, and no one offered a greeting or even a simple nod. He took a moment to look around, trying to see the store through the eyes of someone unfamiliar with its layout or luxuries. As he walked toward a display of watches, he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. It was a subtle reception, like an unspoken rule that he didn't belong here. At least, not as the man he appeared to be now. A young employee walked by him, her eyes scanning him briefly before she turned away, a slight frown on her face. Jason felt a flash of annoyance, but forced himself to remain calm. "Excuse me?" he called out, raising his hand slightly. The employee's gaze flicked toward him for a brief second, before she looked away, adjusting a display on a nearby shelf, as if she hadn't heard him. Jason hesitated, watching her back as she moved further down the aisle. "Excuse me," he tried again, louder this time, hoping to catch her attention. But the young woman continued straightening items, her posture stiff and her expression carefully blank. Without a word, she drifted further away, clearly avoiding his gaze. Jason exhaled, tension building in his chest. This was only the beginning, he reminded himself. He'd give them every chance to prove him wrong, to show the rumors were misunderstandings. He wanted to believe in the people he had hired and in the brand he'd built. But as he walked deeper into the store, his optimism began to waver. The subtle glances, the careful distance, the slight air of dismissal from each employee he passed. It was all beginning to form a picture he hadn't expected. Jason realized, with a sinking feeling, that this could even be worse than the rumors had made it out to be. Jason was acutely aware of how the store employees seemed to glide past him without so much as a nod. It had been so long since Jason had been treated like this. As he strolled through the aisles, he took in the layout of the space, the elegance of the displays, and the careful attention to luxury. Everything about the store was designed to create a luxurious experience, but now he was beginning to wonder, for whom? He approached a glass case featuring the newest collection of designer watches with a price tag that would make most people think twice. He knew these watches well. They were one of his store's signature items, handpicked by him for their elegance and exclusivity. Hell, he had just dumped one of the models on display in the duffel bag at the store where he bought the ordinary clothes he was wearing now. As he leaned in to admire the detail on a particular model, he noticed a sales associate, a young woman with neatly tied hair and a name tag that read Emily, watching him from a distance. Jason made eye contact with her, smiling faintly, hoping she'd approach. Instead, Emily seemed to hesitate. Her expression was polite but cautious. She took a step in his direction but then paused, her eyes flicking from Jason's worn sneakers to his plain t-shirt. It felt as if she was trying to determine if he would be able to afford the watches on display. With a slight shake of her head, she turned and walked briskly to the other side of the store, where a well-dressed white couple was browsing the latest handbag collection. "Hello, can I help you find anything?" Jason heard her ask the couple, her voice friendly and warm. "Yes, actually, I'm interested in that new bag in the window," the woman replied, her tone bright. Jason exhaled, feeling a flash of annoyance. Still, he tried to brush it off. For a moment, Jason wondered if he was overreacting. Maybe she had just decided to attend to them first because they were closer to her than him. But the subtle cues were undeniable. He'd been in this world long enough to recognize the look in Emily's eyes. A quick assessment, a judgment call. He wasn't worth her time. Jason reminded himself that he was here to observe, not to let his emotions get the better of him. Still, he couldn't help but feel the sting of the dismissal, a reminder of a past he had worked so hard to leave behind. As a young man growing up in a poor neighborhood, he had faced discrimination countless times, but that was decades ago, before he'd achieved the level of success that now shielded him from such treatment. Or so he had thought. As he was lost in his thoughts, a second associate passed nearby. "Excuse me," Jason tried, raising a hand slightly. The associate gave him a quick, dismissive glance, muttering, "I'll be with you in a minute," before walking toward another customer, a sharply dressed man just entering the store. "Welcome to Russell & Co., sir," the associate greeted the newcomer. "How may we assist you today?" Jason's stomach tightened. He watched as the man was led immediately to a display of exclusive items, receiving the attentive service Jason himself had once intended for all his customers. Jason moved further into the store, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He approached another display, this one showcasing a row of Italian leather wallets, carefully arranged by color. As he lifted a wallet to examine it, a different employee approached him, a tall man with slicked-back hair, his suit a sharp navy blue. The name on his tag read, Connor. Jason immediately remembered approving his promotion as the store manager. "I'm the manager of the store. Can I help you with something?" Connor's tone was flat, his expression devoid of warmth. It was a stark contrast to the courteous smiles Jason remembered instructing his staff to offer every customer. Jason smiled politely. "Yes, I was just admiring this collection. It's quite impressive." Connor's eyes narrowed, glancing at Jason's plain t-shirt and jeans. Jason could tell that Connor's mind was making calculations about his supposed worth as a customer. After a tense pause, Connor gave a tight smile. "Well, these items are part of our high-end collection. They can be a little pricey," he said, emphasizing the last two words with an edge that felt like a jab. Jason raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the man's condescension. He was tempted to pull out his credit card and buy the most expensive item in the store just to wipe that look off Connor's face. But he resisted. He wasn't here to prove anything about himself. He was here to uncover the truth about his store's culture. Instead, he responded with a calm, neutral tone. "Price isn't an issue for me." Connor's smile flickered, uncertainty creeping into his gaze, but he didn't relent. "These pieces require a certain level of commitment," he continued, his words hanging heavily in the air. It was obvious that Connor was trying to tell him that he didn't belong there. Taking a deep breath, Jason put the wallet back on the display and moved away. The hurt from Connor's words was unbelievable to him. He hadn't expected this, not in a store he owned, not from people he had overseen their hiring and training. Jason had tried to build a culture of respect for every customer who walked through those doors, but his own store was rejecting him, and the irony was bitter. As he walked further into the store, Jason noticed occasional glances from the store security guard in his direction. The guard, a broad-shouldered man with an intense expression, seemed to be focusing his attention solely on Jason, his gaze following his every move with a practiced, almost predatory look. Jason felt betrayed when he realized what was happening. He was being watched and monitored, as if he were a potential threat rather than a paying customer. He continued browsing, making an effort to appear as normal as possible, but he could feel the guard's gaze following his every move. The guard moved closer, as Jason moved closer to a display case of expensive sunglasses. Jason, hands now in his pockets, looked at the guard, his expression a blend of disappointment and quiet anger. "Is there a problem?" Jason asked, his voice low and calm, though every word was edged with restrained emotion. The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking to Jason's worn sneakers and simple attire. "No problem, sir," he replied, though his tone betrayed his skepticism. "Just making sure everything's in order." Jason nodded slowly, a sad smile playing on his lips. He understood the implication all too well. People who looked like him, people who dressed like him, were considered a problem in this store. He was reminded of the countless times he had been followed, ignored, or treated as a suspect in his youth. The years he had spent building his career, creating a brand, and amassing wealth had given him a shield against this reality. But today, that shield was gone, and with it, the illusion that his store might be different from the others. As he turned away, Jason couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced this same scrutiny, this same silent exclusion, under his roof. He thought of the young black men who might have stepped into his store, eager to experience the luxury he had designed, only to be met with skepticism and poor customer service. His heart ached at the thought. He had worked so hard to create a brand that would elevate people and make them feel special. And yet here he was, standing in his own store, feeling like an intruder. Determined to see this through, Jason continued to explore the store, making a mental note of every subtle comment, every cold glance, and every dismissive tone. He began to sense a pattern in the staff's behavior, a hierarchy of respect based on appearance and presumed wealth. Customers in suits and designer dresses received warm greetings and enthusiastic service, while those like him, those who didn't immediately project wealth and status, were treated with thinly veiled disdain. And the reception was even worse for black and brown people. As Jason neared a final display by the store's exit, he saw Emily again. This time, she was engaged with a customer, a white man in a sharp suit. Jason couldn't help but notice how her face lit up with a warm smile. "So, this model is made from the finest Italian leather," Emily said, her tone enthusiastic. "It's both timeless and durable, and we've had a lot of positive feedback from clients." The man gave a nod, clearly impressed. "I do like the feel of it. What other colors does it come in?" "Let me show you." She gestured to a nearby display, making sure to point out every detail with care. Jason noted how thoroughly she explained each option, lingering on the benefits of each product. Her laughter and friendly tone conveyed effortless warmth. Jason felt a pang of disappointment. He had hired employees like Emily because he believed in their potential to embody his vision, a vision of inclusivity and respect. Watching her now, he wondered if he'd been too naive. As he finally exited the store, Jason felt extremely disappointed. What he had just experienced was more painful than any insult. It was the quiet dismissal, the look that said, "You don't belong here," that hurt the most. But Jason knew this was just the beginning. He would return, again and again, until he had the full picture, and only then would he act. Jason returned to the store a few days later, still dressed in the same clothes he had used the day before. This time, he wore a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. He didn't want the security guard to recognize him from the day before. Jason wanted to experience the store in the same anonymity as before. Today, however, he was more prepared and ready to record every gesture and comment from his employees. As Jason stepped inside, he couldn't help but feel proud of the space he had worked so hard to create. He could still not believe his store was being unreceptive of people who looked just like him. As Jason walked, he noticed that the employees barely glanced his way. The lack of interest in their expressions, the way their eyes slid over him as if he were invisible, hurt just as deeply as the outright dismissals he had experienced on his last visit. He scanned the store for any signs of a familiar face from his last visit. As he walked toward the men's accessories section, he caught sight of Connor from his previous visit. He was engaged in conversation with a well-dressed white woman who was admiring a line of leather handbags. Jason watched as Connor leaned in, offering her a warm, genuine smile. His demeanor was inviting and cheerful. Jason was finding it hard to reconcile Connor's tone now with the cold indifference he had shown him just a few hours ago. Despite how he felt, Jason was determined to remain calm. He waited for Connor to finish with the woman, and then approached him. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Connor looked at him, his face sliding back into the mask of polite detachment. "Yes?" he replied, his tone clipped as if dealing with Jason were a chore. "I was interested in one of the wallets I saw here last time. Could you help me with that?" Connor's lips pressed into a thin line, and he let out a barely audible sigh. "Sure. Our wallets are here," he said, gesturing curtly to the display case. "They start at $800, and no, we don't offer discounts," he added, his voice carrying an edge of warning. Jason resisted the urge to react, his fists clenching subtly at his sides. He knew the meaning behind Connor's statement, that he assumed Jason wouldn't be able to afford anything in the store. Despite everything in him wanting to confront Connor then and there, Jason merely nodded and followed him to the display. As Connor began explaining the features of each wallet with the same uninterested tone, Jason couldn't help but think of how he could remedy this terrible situation. He had come here to understand the problem within his store, and now he was seeing it laid bare. Connor, like Emily, seemed to judge customers solely by their appearance, treating them according to an unspoken hierarchy based on race and what they were wearing. And yet, Jason realized he couldn't simply stop at observing. He would need to confront this prejudice head-on if he were to make any real changes. When Connor finished quickly rambling about the wallet, Jason thanked him and moved on, leaving the employee to return to his more desirable clientele. Jason was filled with anger and frustration, but he was determined to gain more insights. He slowly moved to the back of the store, where a row of designer shoes lined the walls like trophies. As he browsed through the aisles, Jason encountered another employee, a young woman named Sarah. She was stalking a shelf with her back turned to him as he approached. Jason cleared his throat to get her attention, and she turned around, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. Immediately, he saw a flicker of apprehension cross her face, a hesitation so brief it was almost unnoticeable. She smiled, but it was a tight, forced expression. "Hi," Jason said, maintaining a polite tone. "I was wondering if you could help me with these shoes." Sarah nodded, quickly composing herself. "Of course," she replied, her voice pleasant but devoid of the warmth he had seen her offer other customers the day before. When Jason asked if he could try a pair on, Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking to his sneakers. Her smile faded slightly. "Well," she began, her tone uncertain, "we usually reserve fittings for serious buyers. Our products are high-end, you know?" Jason's jaw tightened. He forced himself to keep his tone steady, though every word felt like an effort. "I understand," he said. "And I'm a serious buyer." Sarah's cheeks reddened slightly, and she nodded, retrieving a pair of shoes for him to try. As he slipped them on, Jason couldn't ignore the sting of her words. She had assumed he wasn't serious enough for their products, a presumption based on nothing but his outward appearance. Even after proving his interest, her demeanor remained distant, and her body language was stiff and formal. After he left the shoe section, Jason walked aimlessly, his mind replaying each interaction, dismissal, and judgment he had encountered since entering the store. He tried to imagine himself as any other customer, as someone who had simply come in to enjoy the luxury experience. But the illusion was impossible to maintain. Instead of feeling welcomed, he felt scrutinized, judged, and excluded. all in a store he had built with the vision of inclusivity and respect. Jason was yanked out of his thoughts by a commotion at the entrance. He turned to see a young black man in casual clothing entering the store. His gaze was hesitant as he took in the luxurious surroundings. The man looked to be in his 20s, with a reserved composure that suggested he wasn't accustomed to such environments. Jason noticed him glancing around nervously, as if he was worried he'd made a mistake by coming inside. Almost immediately, Jason saw the shift in the employees' behavior. One by one, their eyes turned toward the man, their expressions hardening into masks of guarded suspicion. The young man's presence seemed to trigger a hidden alarm, and Jason watched, horrified, as the security guard approached him, his stance tense and intimidating. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, his voice low and unfriendly. The young man looked startled, his hands lifting slightly as if to show he meant no harm. I just wanted to look around," he replied, his tone polite, though his face reflected a mix of embarrassment and unease. The guard's gaze remained cold, unyielding. "We don't allow loitering," he said, his words pointed and sharp. "If you're not here to buy something, I suggest you leave." Jason's stomach twisted. He couldn't stand by and watch this young man be treated with such disdain, especially knowing that he had been experiencing similar treatment, but more subtly. But Jason knew that if he intervened now, his cover would be blown. He was torn between his desire to protect the young man and his need to see the true depth of this issue fully exposed. After a tense pause, the young man nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of hurt and resignation. "I understand," he murmured, his voice barely audible. With one last look around the store, he turned and walked back toward the entrance, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As the door closed behind him, Jason felt a surge of anger, unlike anything he had felt before. This was more than a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a deep-seated culture of prejudice and exclusion that had somehow taken root in his business. A business he had built from the ground up, a business meant to welcome everyone who walked through its doors. Jason knew he couldn't keep coming back as an observer. If he didn't act, nothing would change. As Jason stood thinking about ways he could bring about change to the store, Connor walked up to him with a different security guard from before. The guard crossed his arms as he stood behind Connor, his stance tense and unwelcoming. "It's obvious you won't be able to afford anything in here," Connor said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Please leave." Jason looked up, surprised, his expression calm but his mind racing. He held Connor's gaze, hoping for even a hint of decency. "I haven't caused any trouble," Jason replied evenly. "I'm simply browsing." Connor scoffed, shaking his head. "Browsing? Look, we have a standard here, a certain type of customer. And no offense," he said, though his voice carried anything but politeness. "But it's clear you're not that type." Jason's jaw tightened, though he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. "So, you're asking me to leave because I don't look like I belong here?" Connor raised an eyebrow, a faint, smug smile appearing on his lips. "I'm just saving you time, buddy," he replied as if offering a favor. "Our products are exclusive. And frankly, if you can't understand that, maybe this place isn't for you." Jason took a slow breath, feeling the weight of years of hard work, struggle, and pride stir within him. He had walked into his own store, and here he was, being treated as if he were beneath its standards, by someone who had been hired to represent the very values he had built the brand upon. The security guard shifted, taking a step closer to Jason, his hand lightly resting on his radio. Jason glanced at him, feeling the unspoken threat in the gesture. He looked back at Connor, who stood waiting, an arrogant gleam in his eyes. "I understand perfectly," Jason replied, his voice soft but steady. "Don't worry, I'll leave." Without another word, Jason turned and walked toward the exit, his steps measured, the indignity and anger simmering within him. As he reached the door, he turned to look back at Connor, who was already moving on to greet a customer dressed in a tailored suit with a warm, welcoming smile. Jason pushed the door open and stepped outside, a quiet resolve settling over him. He had seen enough. As he stepped into the busy Manhattan streets, his mind replayed the events of the past few visits, each one another piece of a picture he had been reluctant to believe. It was like trying to hold water in his hands, a truth he could no longer ignore. His company, a business he had built to be welcoming, respectful, and inclusive, had become a place where people were judged, mistreated, and even turned away based on appearance and race. Jason felt his anger bubble to the surface, an anger he had worked hard to master over the years. He remembered the early days of his career, facing closed doors and dismissive glances as he tried to pitch his business ideas. He remembered the prejudice he had faced not just from competitors, but sometimes even from potential investors who doubted his abilities based on his background. Those experiences had once fueled him and had given him the drive to prove his worth. But he hadn't expected to face those same prejudices within his own walls, from his own employees. Jason walked a few blocks to clear his mind, letting the city's chaotic energy wash over him. Manhattan was a city that both tested and rewarded, where he had tasted both struggle and triumph. And yet, for all his success, for all the influence he had gained, he found himself feeling powerless at that moment, a rare and bitter feeling. His thoughts shifted to the young man he had watched being turned away by the security guard. The look of resignation in the man's eyes had struck him deeply, reminding him of his own early years when he'd had no choice but to accept similar treatment in order to survive. But now, Jason was no longer that young, vulnerable man. He had the power, the resources, and the authority to make a difference. And it was his responsibility to wield that power with purpose. Jason took a deep breath as he tried to make out his next move. This was his breaking point, his moment of decision. Ignoring the problem wasn't an option, nor was simply issuing a reprimand to his employees. This issue ran deeper, infecting the very culture he had strived to create. He would need to address it from the top down to root out the prejudices that had quietly crept into his business. That evening, Jason sat at his desk, staring at a notebook filled with hastily scribbled observations from his visits to the store. Each entry was a painful reminder of the discrimination he had witnessed and felt firsthand, but it also served as fuel for his next steps. He began to draft a plan, one that would not only address the behavior of individual employees, but also tackle the very policies and attitudes that had allowed such discrimination to fester. He considered calling an emergency meeting with his top executives, but he hesitated. He knew that to achieve lasting change, he would need to approach this carefully and thoughtfully. A confrontation with the store managers would be necessary, but it couldn't be a simple reprimand. No, he wanted them to understand the gravity of their actions, confront their own biases, and recognize the harm they had caused. Jason's resolve grew as he mapped out his next steps. The following day, he would meet with the regional manager who oversaw that particular store and the lead executives responsible for retail operations. But this wouldn't be just another meeting. This would be a reckoning. He imagined how the conversation might go, how they might try to defend themselves, to justify their actions as standard protocol or brand preservation. He knew he would be walking into a room filled with defensive justifications, but he was prepared for that. Every look, every dismissive tone, every act of condescension he had experienced in that store had fortified his resolve. Jason planned to attend the meeting with a few specific points. First, he would demand a complete retraining of the staff, not only in customer service but also in unconscious bias and inclusivity. The training would be mandatory and comprehensive and would involve every employee, from sales associates to senior management. Second, he intended to introduce new policies that would redefine what it meant to serve a diverse clientele, setting clear expectations that anyone found guilty of discriminatory behavior would face consequences, regardless of their position. But even that wasn't enough for Jason. He wanted a systemic change, something that would ensure these attitudes couldn't creep back in over time. He decided to implement a new feedback system, allowing customers and employees to report incidents anonymously. These reports would go through the usual management structure and come directly to him so that he could keep a vigilant eye on the culture within his stores. As he worked through his plan, Jason felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. This was his way of reclaiming his business, of ensuring it reflected the values he had built his life around. But he knew that this wasn't just about policy changes. He needed a moment of accountability, a direct confrontation with the store managers to determine whether they were aware of the behavior being carried out. The next morning, as Jason walked toward his company's headquarters, he felt an unfamiliar calm settle over him. He was done questioning himself, done debating his decision. The meeting was set for noon, and as the time approached, Jason took a final moment to review his plan. The regional manager, the head of retail operations, and the senior store manager of the flagship location were all scheduled to attend. It would be a closed-door meeting, private and intense, allowing him to confront them without the pretense of formality. He knew he would be walking into a tense room, that they would be unprepared for the conversation he was about to have. Jason could only try to imagine their surprise when they realized the depths of what he had discovered, the extent to which he had seen the actions of his employees firsthand. And he wanted that moment of shock. He wanted them to feel the discomfort and accountability and to understand that things could not proceed as normal. As he entered the boardroom, Jason took his seat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He felt the eyes of his managers on him, curiosity mixed with a hint of nervousness as they waited for him to speak. But Jason remained silent for a few moments, letting the weight of the atmosphere settle over them. Finally, he looked up with a piercing gaze. "I called this meeting today," he began, his voice calm yet carrying a hard edge, "because there's an issue in our company that goes against everything I built it for. I've experienced it personally, and I can assure you, it's not something I will allow to continue." He saw the flicker of confusion on their faces, a brief exchange of glances as they tried to piece together his meaning. But Jason had no intention of softening his message. He was here to confront them, to hold them accountable, and to ensure that from this moment forward, his stores would reflect the values he had fought for his entire life. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, a tense quiet settling over the assembled managers. Sitting across from him were Alan, the regional manager who oversaw the flagship store, Marissa, the head of retail operations, and Connor, the store manager who had shown Jason nothing but indifference on his visits. It was obvious that he didn't recognize him, and Jason wasn't planning on letting him know. Marissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at Alan before looking back at Jason. "Of course, Jason. We're always open to discussing improvements," she offered with a polite smile, though her voice was tinged with caution. Jason let her words settle, but he didn't return her smile. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to lay out what he had experienced. "Over the past week, I visited our luxurious store in Manhattan several times. Each time, I went in as a regular customer dressed in normal clothes. I didn't tell anyone who I was, and what I encountered was shocking." A flicker of confusion crossed their faces, quickly replaced by surprise. Connor, the store manager, raised an eyebrow, clearly struggling to process Jason's statement. You visited the store?" he stammered, his usually confident demeanor faltering. "Yes," Jason replied, his voice growing firmer. "And what I saw was discrimination, plain and simple. I experienced it myself, and I saw it directed at others as well. Customers, especially those who didn't look or dress a certain way, were treated with disrespect, indifference, even suspicion. It was subtle at times, but unmistakable." Connor's face turned pale, and he opened his mouth as if to protest, but Jason cut him off with a steady hand. "Let me finish," Jason said, his tone brooking no argument. He glanced around the table, his gaze hard. "When I founded this company, I had one vision: to create a brand that welcomed everyone, regardless of race, background, or appearance. I wanted people to feel valued the moment they walked through our doors. What I experienced in that store was the opposite." Alan, the regional manager, cleared his throat, a faint look of discomfort clouding his expression. "I'm sure there must be some misunderstanding, Jason. Our employees are trained extensively in customer service. They understand the importance of welcoming every client." Jason burned with anger, and he turned his full attention to Alan. "Do they? Because what I saw was a system of judgment and bias. Employees making snap decisions about who belongs based on appearance alone. I was treated as though I didn't deserve to be there. I was judged, ignored, even followed by security as if I were a threat." A heavy silence settled over the room. Marissa looked down, avoiding Jason's gaze, while Connor's face turned an uncomfortable shade of red. Jason leaned forward, his voice dropping to a lower, more intense tone. This isn't just a customer service issue. This is about the culture we're building, one that should stand for respect, inclusivity, and dignity. But instead, I witnessed a hierarchy based on appearance, where people who don't fit a narrow standard are dismissed. That isn't the culture I want, and it isn't the culture I will tolerate. Connor finally spoke, his voice defensive. With all due respect, Mr. Russell, we're just trying to maintain the brand's exclusivity. Our clientele expects a certain experience, and sometimes that means being cautious about certain customers. Jason's jaw tightened. So you're telling me that exclusivity justifies discrimination? He shot back, his voice laced with disbelief. Do you understand how damaging that mindset is? We're not here to turn people away, we're here to welcome them, to make them feel valued. Connor shifted in his seat, and Jason could see sweat forming on his forehead as he spoke. It's not about turning people away. It's about protecting the brand. We've had incidents in the past, and we're simply trying to prevent situations that could harm the store's reputation. Jason let out a sharp, humorless laugh. The only thing harming our reputation right now is the behavior I witnessed. Do you think wealthy clients want to shop in a place where people are treated unfairly based on assumptions? Our brand should represent elegance, yes, but also respect. Those values are not mutually exclusive. Marissa, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, her tone conciliatory. Jason, we understand your concerns, and we apologize if you felt mistreated. But I think we have to consider that our staff are under pressure to deliver a certain standard, and sometimes they may overcompensate. Jason shook his head, a look of disappointment in his eyes. Overcompensate? No, Marissa. This isn't about overcompensation. It's about a fundamental lack of empathy and respect. I want employees who look beyond appearances, who treat every customer with dignity, just as we promised in our mission statement. He pulled out a copy of the company's mission and placed it on the table. Did you forget about this? This was our pledge, the promise that set us apart from other luxury brands. A charged silence followed. Jason took a breath, steadying himself before continuing. When I was a young man starting out, I faced discrimination at every turn. I was judged based on how I looked, not what I had to offer. And I vowed that if I ever achieved success, I would create a space where everyone could feel valued. Yet here we are, and the very values I built this company on have been ignored. Alan looked down, clearly affected by Jason's words. Jason, he said quietly, we didn't know. I don't think any of us realized. Jason nodded, his expression softening slightly. And that's part of the problem. We become complacent, assuming that as long as the numbers look good, everything is fine. But behind those numbers are real people. Customers who have been mistreated, ignored, judged. And if we allow that to continue, we're no better than the companies that once dismissed me. He turned his gaze to Connor, who looked visibly chastened. You especially need to understand this. As a manager, you set the tone for the entire staff. They look to you for cues on how to treat customers. If you model indifference and judgment, they'll follow suit. If you treat customers with dignity, they'll do the same. Connor swallowed hard, nodding, his face reflecting a mixture of shame and understanding. I apologize, Mr. Russell. I never realized. Jason held up a hand, cutting him off. Apologies are just the beginning, Connor. What I need from you, and everyone here, is commitment to change. Real, tangible change. We're going to implement mandatory inclusivity and bias training for every single employee, from associates to managers. This training won't just be a formality, it'll be a foundation on which we rebuild our culture. Marissa and Alan nodded slowly, their expressions solemn. Jason continued, his voice steady. Additionally, I'm establishing an anonymous feedback system. Customers and employees alike will have a direct channel to report incidents of discrimination or unfair treatment, and these reports will come directly to me, so I can ensure this problem is addressed at its roots." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If any of you find this too challenging, too much to adjust to, I understand. But I need leaders who believe in this mission, who will commit to making our stores a welcoming space for everyone. So think carefully about what I'm asking, because this will define our company's future." The weight of his words filled the room. Jason watched as his managers processed the gravity of the change he was demanding. Slowly, one by one, they nodded, their faces reflecting a newfound understanding, a realization that they were being called to uphold something greater than themselves. "Thank you for listening," Jason said finally, his tone softening. "We're in this together. I need each of you to be part of this transformation, to bring our company back to the values that it was built on. This isn't just about good business. It's about being the kind of company we can be proud of." With that, Jason stood, signaling the end of the meeting. His managers rose as well, their expressions a mix of respect, determination, and perhaps a hint of awe. Jason gave each of them a nod, silently conveying his trust and expectation. As he left the room, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had done what was necessary, and now, the path forward was clear. This was just the beginning of the journey, but Jason knew that with every step, he was bringing his company closer to the vision he had always held close to his heart. Jason left the confrontation with a sense of calm purpose. The polite, measured tone he'd held in the meeting was gone, replaced by a quiet but strong resolve to set things right and ensure that employees with such character either changed or faced the consequences of their actions. The employees who had created this toxic environment hadn't just misrepresented his brand, they had betrayed the very principles he'd fought to uphold, and Jason wasn't sure he was going to let them off the hook. In the days following the meeting, Jason reviewed every complaint submitted about the flagship store. Each report was a painful reminder of the disrespect, judgment, and dismissal that certain employees had shown to customers. Jason pored over each story, taking notes and forming a mental list of those he held responsible for fostering the discrimination. Karma, he thought, wasn't always an unseen force. Sometimes it required someone with a sense of justice to guide it into action. Connor, the store manager who had treated Jason with barely concealed disdain, was the first on Jason's list. The investigation revealed Connor had been at the heart of most customer complaints, with reports describing him as rude, dismissive, and more interested in preserving the store's exclusivity than in treating people with respect. Jason learned that Connor had even encouraged other employees to be selective with their attention, privately advising them to focus on customers who look like they belong here. Jason decided to show Connor respect by telling him of his decision face to face. He fixed a date and invited Connor into his office for a private meeting. Connor entered the room with a nervous smile. His usual confidence was still in shambles from the previous confrontation in the boardroom. Jason wasted no time on pleasantries. "Connor," Jason began, his voice steady and cold, "your behavior doesn't align with this company's values. You've used your position to create an environment of discrimination and disrespect, one that harms not only our customers, but the reputation of everyone who works here." Connor stammered, trying to form an excuse, but Jason cut him off. "I've reviewed the complaints, and I've made a decision. Effective immediately, you're relieved of your position." Jason's tone left no room for argument. "I've arranged for your severance package, and security will escort you out." The shock on Connor's face was clear, but Jason felt no sympathy. Connor had created a toxic environment that tarnished the company's reputation, and this was his consequence. As Connor left, Jason knew he was sending a clear message. Prejudice and power games would no longer be tolerated. Emily, the young associate who had ignored Jason's requests for help and chosen to serve only desirable customers, was next. Her personnel file showed she was an otherwise competent employee, but reports about her dismissive attitude were frequent. Rather than immediately dismissing her, Jason opted for a different approach, a lesson that would give her a taste of her own medicine. The following day, Jason arranged for Emily to attend a mandatory training session on empathy and bias, led by one of the toughest instructors in the field. This instructor was known for creating exercises that placed participants directly in the shoes of those they had judged or dismissed. For hours, Emily was confronted with scenarios and role-play exercises that forced her to experience the sting of dismissal and indifference firsthand. By the end of the session, Emily was visibly shaken. When she returned to the store, Jason called her into his office. "Emily, I could have let you go," he told her, his voice firm but calm. "But I believe everyone deserves a chance to change. You've seen now how damaging it can be to judge others based on appearance. I expect you to prove that you've learned from this experience. If I hear one more complaint about your attitude, you'll be dismissed. Understood?" Emily nodded, her face pale. Jason could see the realization sinking in, the understanding that her actions had real consequences. He hoped that this lesson would resonate with her, pushing her to rethink her behavior moving forward. Alan, the regional manager, was next on Jason's list. As the person in charge of overseeing the flagship store, Alan had not only failed to intervene in the store's toxic culture, but had indirectly encouraged it by pushing for brand exclusivity and tolerating Connor's biases. Jason held him particularly responsible for fostering the environment of elitism that had permeated the store. Jason arranged another meeting, this time bringing in Marissa, the head of retail operations, to bear witness. Alan entered the office with a tense composure. "Alan," Jason began, "I've reviewed your handling of the flagship store and frankly I'm disappointed. You had a duty to ensure the culture there aligned with our values, yet you allowed it to grow into a place where certain people felt unwelcome." Alan attempted to defend himself, but Jason held up a hand to silence him. "Your actions and decisions have damaged our reputation and alienated customers. For that, I'm holding you accountable." Jason didn't fire Alan outright. Instead, he demoted him, stripping him of his regional oversight and reducing his role to that of a standard store manager in a smaller location. "Consider this a chance to reflect and rebuild your reputation," Jason told him. "You'll work under the same policies you've neglected, and I'll be watching to ensure that you uphold them." The demotion was a significant blow to Alan's ego and career trajectory, but Jason felt it was a fair outcome. By losing his position of privilege, Alan would be forced to confront the consequences of his actions, and perhaps emerge with a new perspective on leadership and respect. Sarah, another sales associate, had also been implicated in customer complaints, though her actions were less blatant. Jason knew from her file that she was a relatively new hire, and her behavior, while discriminatory, seemed more influenced by the culture that Connor had fostered rather than personal malice. Jason decided to address her case with a warning, offering her a chance to prove she could adapt to the new standards. In their meeting, Jason was candid. "Sarah, I'm aware of the complaints about your attitude towards certain customers. It's clear you've allowed the wrong behaviors to influence your actions, and I'm giving you this one opportunity to change. From today forward, I expect you to approach every customer with respect and courtesy. If you can't do that, you'll no longer work here." Sarah, who was visibly nervous, nodded vigorously, promising to make the necessary adjustments. Jason saw the remorse in her eyes, and he hoped that she, like Emily, would learn from this and grow. With the key players held accountable, Jason turned his focus to establishing safeguards that would prevent such a toxic culture from developing again. He strengthened the feedback system, ensuring that any reports of discrimination would be flagged immediately and addressed directly by his team. Regular audits were set up to evaluate employee behavior, and an anonymous whistleblower hotline was established, empowering employees to report bias or toxic behavior without fear of retribution. Jason also implemented quarterly refresher training sessions to reinforce inclusivity and empathy. He met personally with each store manager to review expectations, making it clear that this was a zero-tolerance policy. Any form of discrimination, judgment, or elitism would lead to immediate consequences. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the flagship store transformed. Customers began to notice a shift in the employees' attitudes, a warmth and professionalism that welcomed everyone, regardless of appearance. The employees who had remained understood that Jason's expectations were non-negotiable, that they were expected to represent the values he held dear. Jason's actions became a form of karma for those who had fostered a toxic environment, each facing a direct consequence of their behavior. For Connor, it was the loss of his career. For Emily, it was a harsh lesson in empathy. For Alan, it was the stripping of privilege. And for Sarah, it was the chance to grow or leave. In the end, Jason's story isn't just about justice. It's a reminder of how respect and dignity can transform lives and cultures. How often do we judge without understanding the full picture? Respect is a choice we all can make. What would you have done in Jason's shoes? I do love to hear your thoughts below, and subscribe for more untold life stories.